distinguished guests, my name is Gudrun Johnsen. I'm an Icelander, an academic, and a banker. Today, we have carefully examined the fundamental fault lines that lie through our financial markets. I trust that Rob Johnson is going to walk us through the events of today, so I want to spend my time at the podium to describe to you an extreme case of how finance can wreak havoc on an entire country. The case of Iceland, my home country. Paraphrasing Madame Lagarde, Icelanders indeed threw themselves out of the window following the bankers, I'm afraid. But here's the short story. After a questionable privatization process, the balance sheets of the Icelandic banks grew from 1.6 times the country's GDP in 2004 to almost 10 times GDP in less than 4 years' time. Think about that. Iceland is a tiny country. We are about 330,000 people who live on a rather large island, so I encourage you to come visit. There's plenty of space. Making this growth of the financial sector completely absurd. There was no real justification put forward to grow the system to this size. It did not support the real sector in any proportion. Not only that, it robbed the real economy out of talent and resources. Yet nothing was done to stop this development. Quite the contrary, it was encouraged because a handful of people who benefited hugely were able to gain political support for it. No one could foresee the enormous cost that would later be incurred by every single Icelander. The growth of the banking sector was justified by a concern that Iceland would lose out on tax revenues. Have you heard it before? If the banks would relocate to other countries. Now consider this. The tax revenue collected from the banks was 0.6% of GDP a year on average during the 5 years in the run-up to the collapse. Total corporate tax collected annually during these years was in the range of 2 to 2.7% of GDP. Now let me tell you about the cost of this 0.6% of GDP in corporate tax collected from banks, remember, that had grown to be 1,000% of GDP. As soon as the banks collapsed, the Central Bank of Iceland had to be refunded through government bond amounting to 60% of government budget that year, and at a very high interest rate, reflecting a state in a crisis. The government became hugely indebted overnight, and the central bank went technically bankrupt as a result of lending to the Icelandic banking system. The Icelandic currency lost more than half of its value and has only marginally recovered since. Many workers have seen their wages been cut, real wages been cut in half, as nominal wages were also lowered, not least to those with the most experience and the best education. To meet this loss in income, in order to deliver on financial obligations such as student loans, regular people in the middle of their careers withdrew 8% of GDP from their pension funds to make ends meet. And that will, future generations and taxpayers will have to cover that down the road. Data that came out just last week shows the average wealth of people in the age group of 35 to 50 has been reduced to 1997 levels. So the crisis brought their wealth back 20 years. Almost 7 years down the road now, firms are still leaving the country. Investment is still at historic low. The signs of brain drain are becoming more and more evident. undermining both education system and the healthcare system. This is not counting the reduced pension to current pensioners, not counting the really big numbers, namely the loss in output, loss incurred by creditors, reputational loss, loss of social cohesion. In fact, we will never be able to quantify the entire loss to our society, brought about by the bankruptcy of systemically important banks. Now, I am not making these points to tell you that Icelanders are suffering. In fact, they are still fortunate in so many ways. I am making these points to tell you that none of this needed to happen. It was caused by bad banking, blatant over-financialization of the economic system, inappropriate fiscal and monetary responses, captured accountants, and failed policymaking in keeping the bankers in check. Our conference today has touched on exactly the problems of the Icelandic case. It is clear now that this was not about evil bankers without morals. We cannot rely on personal ethics and morals as the main underpinning of our financial system. Rather, the problems were allowed to develop by a faulty system where individuals can take advantage while society loses out. This also means that we should not be so concerned only about bankers learning lessons and becoming ethical. We should, however, be concerned with building a financial system where the actors internalize the consequences of the risk they take by demanding that they put their own skin in the game through equity stakes that are there to absorb the losses when the markets turn against them. And we need a system that makes the players accountable for their actions. Here I am proud to say that we have done well in Iceland. We prosecuted many of those that acted against the law, and we brought them to justice. And as Annette and Brooksley Bourne talked about, only policymakers can change the system. But most of the time, they only do so if the public demands a better system. Therefore, we need transparency so that the public can understand the system and how the system works currently against them. This is really the main challenge. In Iceland, due to the official investigative effort that I took part in, there was an understanding of who the victim is. This made it easier for us to prosecute the crimes that were committed, as well as writing down debt to sustainable levels for households and corporates alike, leaving the ones who took the risk of reckless lending with the losses that were incurred. It is my hope that the same awareness will be brought about elsewhere, creating the necessary capital, political capital, for politicians to spend on meaningful reforms, making our financial system simpler, more transparent, and efficient in supporting the real sector and increasing economic and social welfare for all. That is precisely what the organizers of this conference have been working on. I know I won't step on anyone's toes by listing Anna Dadmati as first among equals in this effort to bring about change. She has selflessly and tirelessly showed us all how academics can really make an impact and bring about smart policy making for the betterment of society. I also want to extend my sincerest gratitude to another first among equal, Rob Johnson, and his amazing staff at INET, among them Marshall Auerbach, Chris Seeley, and Ramon Contreras, who have bent backwards fulfilling every demand of the high maintenance ladies of the organizing committee. I ask you to give them a good hand for taking such good care of us all. Last but not least, I want to mention that INET has given us this extraordinary opportunity to be able to reach out to all of you here present, hoping to inspire you to get engaged in correcting the information system, information asymmetry, building strong banks and prudent banks, a financial system that works for us all. I want to thank all of you here for participating, the incredible speakers who donated their time to enlighten us and share their wisdom. Finally, I gotta say that I think that this conference has made it clear how important it is to create awareness and educate on how regular, hard-working people who have no direct relations to the financial industry have fallen prey to the distortions of our system. A system that we must fix, or we will all become Icelanders. That's it. The floor is yours, Rob Johnsen.